the Social Justice Institute. Claudia, I will continue to monitor the group and admit people as they try to come in.
Excellent.
We have a number of people still joining us. The first session with Tim Black and Crystal Taskin was really amazing, and we look forward to this one. We encourage you to try to end a few minutes early so people can get a stretch break before the next session. And actually the next session is noon, so that's not as important. There is a networking session at noon if people want to join that. And so take it away, Claudia.
Okay, well, I'm going to share my screen because I have some PowerPoints, if that's all right. So I will open that up and hopefully people can see that, and I'll open up the slideshow. So I assume that's visible. If it's not, please let me know. And please let me know if you have any difficulty hearing me. And also, I am not putting myself forward as somebody who knows all about this or has any particular answers. I'm sharing with you things that we've been learning about the impact of redlining in Cleveland. But I will hope very much that you will send comments or questions in chat as we go along. If Mark is monitoring that, that would be helpful. So I'll just dive right in. So as I was thinking about this presentation, I have made parts of this presentation before to City Council and people in Cleveland, but I had recently listened to a webinar by Mark Joseph, and he was really, he titled it Bringing a Racial Equity Lens to Urban Planning, and he was talking to planners. But he very carefully and thoughtfully gave some advice to people who were, attempting to do better with this and move in this direction to have more depth, to have more understanding. And he suggested four important questions, but I wanted to mention three. And he first said, it's really important to open your mind and start with curiosity. When you see something, don't jump to the first conclusion of, what may be behind that or the explanation. Really, he said, lean in and, take risks to dig deeper and ask questions. He also said, and this was really someplace that I had felt was very important too, was that structure is where our minds should be heading often when we have curiosity about why something's happened. And certainly redlining falls into this category of, really being a potentially pervasive source of a number of things that we may see today we say are wrong or puzzling, or maybe we have some ideas about them, but our ideas might not really be very accurate if we haven't dug deeply into structure. And he mentioned also disaggregating data to look for patterns across outcomes. So this is something I think you'll see in this presentation. And then what I, don't have the power to do, but I hope all of us can, as we think about these things, work toward changing the narrative, asking why, why do these things exist, and tracing their impact. So that's just guided me a little bit, and hope it might guide you in thinking about what you're seeing here. So, what I will argue is that redlining is a key cause of some of the structural disparities in wealth and health by race that we observe today. And you probably already know this, but redlining was what was the term applied to this practice of outlining areas with sizable Black populations in red ink on maps. It was put out as a warning to mortgage lenders, insurers, but it took on a further impact of being utilized in all kinds of thinking. But initially government sponsored by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and it was a sanctioned government practice from 1933 to 1977.
Redlining.
Oh, yeah.
And then I also wanted, I think it's important to note that redlining, although it's a very visible and concrete sign of what was going on historically, really since the 1800s, the latter 1800s, but there were all sorts of laws and government actions continuing into very recent periods that were fostering segregation, fostering separation, fostering and causing disadvantage and barriers and so forth, to especially in relation to housing and neighborhoods. That's what we're talking about today. But of course, there were other policies that caused barriers in other aspects of life. But Richard Rothstein's book, if you haven't read it, is very, very helpful at documenting all kinds of other things like restrictive covenants and deeds and other laws that had a big effect on this. So when Mark said to be curious as a first step, I thought of my curiosity and others' curiosity about wealth and about racial disparities in wealth. And racial disparities in wealth or assets, or what people own and what it's worth, are much more severe, although racial disparities in income are also severe. The wealth disparities are even more severe. And what we do know about wealth is that for middle-class people, about 65% of their assets or what they own come from the value of their principal residence. We also know when that is broken down that housing values appreciate, and that's an important way of that wealth accumulating. But for Black households, the rate of appreciation on their homes is 1/3 the rate of white households. And because of redlining, that plays into that value possibility on the homes, because the typical Black homeowner buys their home, and this historically would be due to racial steering, these redlining practices and all the practices that followed those in a neighborhood that's predominantly Black. So the segregation forces are at play here. And when we look at the differences in wealth, median household wealth, adjusted for inflation, we know that the rich have been getting richer and the poor have been getting poorer in recent years. We know that the income disparities have been getting worse in recent years between the middle class and the extreme wealth. But here what we really also see is that wealth has surged in some populations and has pretty much stayed flat in other populations. So here we see the Black-white disparity in the growth of wealth. And it's not getting any better, it's getting worse. So despite the fact that we may say redlining is currently outlawed, we still, I think, can dig into this with data and see what role redlining may be playing in this disparity, following Mark Joseph's advice to, when we see something, we try to look at structure and take that apart to try to see where it's coming from. And so that's what we're going to be doing with this. And this is just another graphic that further displays the average wealth, housing wealth that people have, and when they may be approaching retirement, which is a particular time when they would be wanting to draw on those assets. And we see that another example of how persistent it is. And this is by the age at which people bought their first home. So another disparity, which we're not going to zero into here, would be that question of disparities in the age at which people get to buy their first home. I think that would be another kind of structural disparity worthy of figuring out more about. So now I want to get into some things we've been seeing in Cleveland. And the first time that I was really had some data to work with that really, to me, starkly showed how these impacts of redlining were extremely powerful in recent times, was when we started doing research on the foreclosure crisis and looking into the loans and the lending practices that were part of the reason that the foreclosure crisis came into being. And so we did a number of studies here in Cleveland, and we uncovered what we called toxic loans. And these were loans that were made to borrowers for exorbitant interest rates, and also foreclosed within a year to 18 months of being initiated. And this seemed to be the most extreme situation of the subprime lending that was really impacting Cleveland. So what we found was that African Americans in Cleveland were 4 times more likely to be given subprime loans rather than prime loans. And their subprime loans were over 8 times more likely to foreclose quickly. And in digging into those loans that were foreclosing quickly, we saw signs that they were what we called toxic, because they were originated across income levels. So here's what you see is, regardless of whether, somebody might have said, well, the reason this happened is that the Black borrowers had lower incomes, and that's why they were given the subprime loans. But we saw that regardless of income, these borrowers were given the subprime loans, and the worst of the subprime loans. So what that signals is that there's something structural and systemic, not about the borrower, but about the lender and what is being available or pushed or offered. And it's a process of exclusion from the more favorable loan products. And it's really across incomes, which I think is a signal that there would be systemic racism or structural racism in the picture here. And then we dug further into who was making these subprime loans and that were foreclosing really quickly. And I know you can't really see this and read all the names, but there were a group of mortgage lenders who had come into the picture during deregulation of the mortgage industry when you no longer had to be a local bank to give out these loans. You could be, I don't know, a storefront in Los Angeles peddling loans in Cleveland. Long Beach Mortgage was actually the worst offender of I'm going to use the word pushing these loans. And we know from qualitative research that there were people going around knocking on doors. It wasn't, the situation where you go to your neighborhood bank and say, will you give me a loan? These were being marketed aggressively. Although this is past information, we were able to bring some attention to this both locally. We got the chance to present in some congressional testimony. And this is now a known and recognized period of the problems of deregulation and how this really got out of control. I have not seen sufficient attention given to the structural racism component of this even yet, but we felt very strongly it was there. And one of the results was wealth stripping from the community. So in this graph, you see the number of houses that came out of this and were sold for less at sheriff's auction for less than $10,000. And the top line is the increase in those sales on the east side of Cleveland. The bottom line is the west side of Cleveland. So I think we see where the wealth stripping happened. We can blame, in some ways, the deregulation in Washington and the flooding of the market with these upstart lending companies that took advantage of this situation. And happily, there were a few lawsuits. We had something in Cleveland where loan fraud was uncovered in some of these instances. Unfortunately, we did not succeed. There were some investigations and lawsuits filed, which were really trying to go after companies like Long Beach Mortgage. We were not successful with that in Cleveland. There was a very important lawsuit in Baltimore, which is very interesting to read about. It's been written about in detail, that was successful, and where they were able to actually listen to recordings of phone calls and look at emails where mortgage brokers and people in these companies were deliberately saying, well, go to that neighborhood where there are a lot of Black homeowners. We can give these loans to them. I mean, that kind of conversation was uncovered in the lawsuit. So this was very predatory and had a terrible effect on Cleveland. Now, moving on to redlining per se, one of the things about redlining that sort of makes it a bit easier to trace some of his impact is that it was all put on maps. So this is a converted map from 1938. The areas in red were the actual red lining that was done by the federal government in their maps. And you can see, this is a map of Cuyahoga County, and you can see sort of the east side of Cleveland being colored in red. Then so this kind of allows us to also map other things that are happening now that we could argue are in some ways the legacy of this structural action by the government to deliberately exclude the Black population from getting access to the products and the loans and the benefits of home ownership and asset development. So that's a picture of those toxic loans that I showed you. from 2004 to 2008, very much maps onto the red line areas. This is a picture of children testing positively for lead poisoning. When wealth and assets are stripped out of neighborhoods, the housing, not surprisingly, takes a hit itself, the quality of the housing. If the value of the home went from $80,000 to $20,000, how are you going to get a loan to repair that home? How are you going to afford to keep the paint up on that home? And those are the kinds of things that release lead into the dust, and children pick up that lead when they're toddlers, and even older children can sort of track the lead dust into the house on their shoes, and younger children can pick it up. So we very definitely see that pattern in lead poisoning, the result of devaluation of the housing. This is a map of life expectancy. And it really, again, points to, I think, asset stripping and then the underinvestment in human life. So we see life expectancy being lower in parts of the city similar to where it was redlined. And these life expectancy figures are put out by the federal government. I don't know that many people have overlaid this with redlining as yet, but that's an additional impact. Here we see a map of upward mobility for children. Some of you may have been following the work of Raj at Harvard. He's done this massive project that's getting lots of national attention, where it's kind of complicated what he's done, but he's linked IRS records cross-generation. So he can see where a child was born. He can link the IRS records of the children to the parents. And he can then see whether the child has upward mobility from income-wise from where their parents were. And sort of, this American myth is that, we're better off generation to the next, and we're achieving the American dream with our upward mobility. And that's not as true for anybody as the myth would say, but it's particularly true for children who grew up in these redlined areas, that they have the lowest chance if their parents were lower middle income, they have the lowest chance of exceeding that in their lifetime compared to others who grew up in different parts of the city. And finally, there's a number of studies. You've probably heard the increasing interest in the effect of neighborhoods on health. And there's more and more evidence that where you live does affect, heart disease, stroke, especially the cardiovascular types of diseases, for example, but other diseases as well, some cancers. So we really, I think in this map of health status, can see the possibility of structural racism of this type. So as a metaphor, getting under the skin and affecting health. So I do want to leave time for people to maybe say, their opinion of what they're seeing in some of these maps. what else can we learn from tracing the impact of redlining? Is this really a good way of trying to understand things? And if it is, how can we sort of deconstruct this? What should we do with this information? Answering Mark's questions, how does this play into perceptions and so forth? So I'm hoping there is a possibility of a little dialogue here. Mark, I don't know if you're going to be monitoring the chat or
There's no, yes, I can do that. Thank you,
how we can
Claudia.
do
First
that.
of all, it is a very powerful presentation. I know most people have muted themselves. I would encourage you to use the chat to either comment or ask a question, or you can unmute yourself. Claudia, you may want to stop sharing your screen so people can
Yep.
see each other a little better, and then we can pull the screens up, the slides up as they are available. And if you do want to ask a question, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself as well? Richard Andrews, who many of us know, has asked, how can we make banks more accountable? CRA doesn't appear particularly effective.
Yeah. So I agree that CRA is very narrowly targeted and has, although there are these standards the banks have to fulfill, they seemingly are able to fulfill them with their by showing their portfolio and then making some rather narrow investments in areas that have been underbanked. But they're not the kinds of investments that that can change that can reverse this deep and almost deep problem, which is when the assets get devalued, then it's very hard to leverage your assets to get ahead. So they are tending to think or to show their CRA, fulfill their CRA reinvestments, but it's really not touching the history of what has happened here. So I believe that law shouldn't be done away with, but it needs to be modified if we're to reverse any of this.
Yeah, I did have a question for you, Claudia. I had experienced white flight moving from East Cleveland to Warrensville Heights. I also worked as a lower tier person within the subprime lending aspect and within when there was a big boom here in Ohio. My question for you is, in terms of redlining and the white flight and the racialized aspect of creating slums or abandoned properties, is it premeditated or calculating in terms of the redlining and the creation of slums? It also appears to be when we talk about entering suburbs of Euclid, Warrensville Heights, Cleveland Heights, or Lakewood, or even South Euclid in terms of white flight and the population or what have you, or even Solon or Twinsburg, there seems to be a direct and distinct population in terms of trajectory. Also talked about covenants. My understanding with Garfield Heights, Garfield Park, and then when we talk about the Cleveland Heights and the East Cleveland border in terms of living in Cleveland Heights and having a racial covenant in terms of having to go to Shaw High School or living in residing in a physical residence within Garfield Heights, but also by the covenant, by administrative covenant of you have to go to Cleveland schools. Are these things ex post facto coming out of a reconstruction period in terms of laws, in terms of containment, racial containment of African American people in terms of trajectory? Because as a child, I didn't know any better. Leaving out of the Glenville riots, my parents getting a VA loan, moving to Warrensville Heights, and then that becoming a quasi slum during the crack epidemic, and then moving back in the HUD, and the expansion of universities and the medical centers within slum areas. Could you
Thank you, Mark.
speak those?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Claudia.
Oh, well, that was a brilliant description of where I think some of this investigation and critical analysis needs to go next, because everything you mentioned, it's not that you can say it is redlining, but the consequences are very similar. And sorting out what aspects are legislative or policy, and how that also plays into perception and behavior. It's not dictated, but is, I don't know, it's powerful, and it's beyond the individual for sure. So it becomes a powerful force that it has the devastating impacts and unequal impacts you're describing. But how do we get our arms around it? How do we get the data organized to elicit it? I have no answer, but I think your analysis is very important and has to be a new direction for looking deeper at a structure that is less obviously structural, but it's structural, very powerful structurally. So
I was saying, was it happenstance? The bottom line, is it happenstance?
yeah.
I mean, my question to you is, it happenstance? These things don't seem to operate in a vacuum.
I'm a complete in complete agreement with you that it's not happenstance, and tracing it it's probably a structure that in part is less visible than redlining, but I don't think it's happenstance at all. And we have to think of ways to surface it, examine it, call it out for what it is, bring it to people's attention, because you're talking about some things that look like they're individual choices, but there's really a systemic forces that have to be called out.
It reminds me of your research on foreclosure and predatory lending. You didn't see the patterns until you collected the data, and then it was clear that this was happening all over the country and all over the county, but it was happening disproportionately. And I think Mark's examples of education and other things, we could do this, and some groups have done that, but I think we need the data to prove the trends, that they are not happenstance and it's not equally distributed. I know Kathy had raised her hand and she has a question. So
yeah, I actually just wanted to make a comment. I'm new to the case faculty, and I
go ahead and introduce yourself, Kathy.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
My name is Kathy Mansfield. I'm on the law school faculty, and I was actually hired partially in an administrative position, so I haven't had time to reach out to you, Claudia, and to your team. But I have been writing about the subprime market from a legal perspective for like 20 years. And I worked at the CFPB for 3 years on the qualified mortgage rule and on the mortgage servicing rules. And I'm also writing a book about mortgage lending in Cleveland.
Oh, great.
So I love the work that you do, and I'm planning to cite it in the book and everything. But one of the things that I found was really interesting when I was looking at the history of both segregation and reverse redlining, or, like basically making loans on bad terms to people of color in the Cleveland area, is that the racism the structural racism was already there when the HOLC came in with their maps. And one of the things that I'm doing in this book, I'm just looking at one block and looking at what happened on this one block starting in 1910.
Wow.
And even the ads in the Plain Dealer for buying property on this block just reeked of racism. It was all subtextual, but it was like, live in a place where you'll be happy who your children are associating with. And the National Association of Realtors had policies against integrated neighborhoods. And so the HOLC actually, I think, was following suit of things that had been started much before and were part of the Great Migration North. And And there's some interesting studies that have come out about whether the HOLC itself did make loans in the red line, like in the red neighborhoods. There's a suggestion that they did make significant numbers of loans in those neighborhoods, but they were still neighborhoods that were already primarily African-American, very poor, sometimes near, you know, environmentally bad places to be. So anyway, so I just wanted to say, to me, it's really interesting the work you've done to see like how those neighborhoods just keep perpetuating the same problems is really significant. And then I also wanted to mention, I actually tried to do a study with a colleague where we were trying to look at how many of those subprime loans were purchase loans and were refinance loans. Yeah, because, you know, the great thing about what they were saying to promote the subprime market was it was the democratization of credit. But in fact, a lot of people who took those terrible loans that you looked at, they already had fairly decent, legitimate loans that they were talked into refinancing into these dangerous loans. And so,
so true. I did, it's not mentioned in those maps or anything, but a lot of those loans were refi.
Yeah.
So where people had already a lot of equity in the home and they lost it when they did the refinancing.
And it was, you know, to answer the previous question, I agree with you. It was intentional, and it was people who made quick money and then sold the loans on the stock market and had no skin in the game on how they performed afterwards. So anyway, I'm looking forward to getting to know you.
I'd love to work together.
So nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
I'm getting some other questions. Thank you, Kathy. Arlette, I'll let you ask the question. And I want to point out to folks that in the chat, there's some great resources, and I would encourage you to add other resources that you're there. So we'll have Arlette, and then we have some other questions that have come in as well. And so, yep.
Oh,
John,
so I was, thank you. I was just asking a question about redlining and how much it's also affected education, K through 12, and to yourself as well as to the group. How do we take that information and make one funding source for education, with that being a way of saying, because of redlining, because of historical racism, how do we use that information? Because K through 12 is definitely being affected, our children. And so if we had one pot of money coming out for Cuyahoga County, what would that look like?
Well, unquestionably, the housing values are depressed, and that yields less property taxes, which are a key component of education funding. And I know over the years, there have been efforts in the state of Ohio to try to make education funding more equitable. I think most of them have failed. I would love to hear comments from the group about where to go, you know, what the next steps are in trying to rectify the inequality in education funding.
You want to ask the group to respond to that?
Yeah. Well, if there are answers, it's not an easy question because it's so resisted by the places that are untouched and have the property values in their grasp. It's so resisted because they want to keep it all.
So I encourage you to respond to that in the chat. There's some more resources that have come up. We have a question here, and I can answer it. Are there examples in the US of successful transitions of under-resourced, segregated neighborhoods into vibrant, mixed income, adequately resourced, and racially diverse neighborhoods?
You can answer that, Mark. Is that what you said?
No, I said you can answer.
Mark Joseph could answer this for us because he heads the National Initiative on Mixed Income Housing. I have paid attention as much as possible to what he's learning, and he's certainly learning that there are signs of success in some areas when things are done right, and when there's a lot of attention paid to deliberately building community and building connections among people in neighborhoods. And there are signs that those connections can flourish. It's very hard though to take that to scale, and because most of the examples are probably in communities of 3 or 4 neighborhoods of maybe 3,000, 2,000 households. It's and they're often, you know, sort of islands in the midst of other more structural segregation. So there's the question of taking it to scale, and then there's it's often not an open market solution that has to be done. It's more of a where there's some big funding that comes in, either through one of the federal programs or through tax credit financing or something. So the question is about can we bring this to scale and use market forces that are what affects the rest of the housing market.
And the good news is that Mark Joseph just yesterday released a published study of 38 essays on what works to promote inclusive, equitable, mixed income communities. And so that will be in there. And I just put you the link to that in the chat. So you can look there, and that's that just came out yesterday. So that's a great segue to that. So one of the questions that came up, Claudia, is any way can folks get the access to the slides? This session is being recorded, and
Yeah.
would you be willing to share the slides with the recording?
Yes.
All right, so we can look on our website. We'll have this presentation and the slides there as well. So the question was, is anybody going to comment on the redlining impact on public school system? Anybody want to take that one on? We got a lot of experts on the call as well, besides Claudia. So.
I do feel it has something to do with the way it's funded in the state of Ohio. I also feel that it has to deal with property taxes in terms of who gets properties. And we're talking about Chagrin Falls, where we're talking about East Cleveland, or where we're talking about Warrensville. We consistently see in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, those at the bottom rung of statistics have lower property taxes. The highest achieving schools, Westlake and so forth, or Solon, have the highest property taxes, or Shaker Heights. And so I see it as a disparity within that, but also see it as a racial disparity, going back to what Claudia said, in terms of appraising. What is the appraised value of a home, and the disinvestment within communities in terms of mortgage lending and banks.
Mm-hmm.
Also, we want to state in conclusion that if we want to be precise and zero in, we have to look at Steve Mnuchin. He was in charge of IndyMac within the California, and was one of the primary movers of private sub-living and parasitism in terms of that. So I think we'll start with property taxes and looking at the racial disparity of property taxes and how schools are funded. And we also have to look at tax incremental funding in terms of gentrification and the upper mobility population of the European or the African American.
Yeah, and in addition to that, as you pointed out, Mark, Ed points out in the chat that the Supreme Court has ruled multiple times that our school funding method is unconstitutional. And I think Ed Choice has only made that worse. And so for public, there's pretty much a concerted effort in both Ohio and in the national level to deconstruct or defund public education and to privatize our education system, and a lot of losers are the folks in the redlined areas in that system. I would also point out, and Ed mentions this as well, about the state's executive and legislative branch will not address this. I think that this is a stacked deck, and we can't look at redlining or housing or property values or education in isolation. It's the combination of these factors that are coming together. And so, and the health data you presented, Claudia, shows that as well. And so, and then you have to think about gerrymandering in the state of Ohio, a state that is pretty much split 50-50, Democrat and Republican, except the legislature is not because of gerrymandering. And so passing any laws around this, we have to get at the systemic erosion of democratic processes in this state and in this country. So these are multi-layered factors. Not to mention the Wall Street laws that allow for this kind of deregulation that allows for this. So it's sometimes daunting, but we can't look at one of these factors in isolation. Just have a couple more minutes. There's links shared here, and I encourage people to we will have these links in the chat available, and I think we can send those out to everyone who registered for this session.
Dr. Chubb, I'll make this within 10 seconds. I mentioned Steve Mnuchin in terms of IndyMac and one of the most egregious subprime lendings. As oftentimes we see these talking people we're representing, whether they come from the White House or pundits on TV. These are not benign individuals or what have you. I think that we must be exacting in terms of looking at a person's history and what have you, and pattern of conduct in terms of having a tremendous impact on this conversation. And the reason why I brought him up is because oftentimes people watch the news or watch things on CNN with no clue in terms of the pervasive impact they've had in terms of their other business endeavors or ventures in terms of parasiticism in this particular realm. Could you speak to that in terms of how clear we must be in terms of career and historicism, in terms of curriculum vitae?
Claudia?
Yeah. I'm just, that was like a punch in the stomach to hear that about the IndyMac to me, because of having dug so deeply into the corruption that and ill will and outright blatant racism behind what we saw in the subprime lending industry. I feel like what you said is so important, and this just would be discouraging to say, but when we were really trying to, I guess you'd say, speak truth to power around this subprime thing in Cleveland, we just got doors slammed in our face, by the so-called local leaders here, because they were so, I guess, beholden, you might say, or in awe of the banks and everything, and the bankers, and it just shocked me, the thinking how blind, how the blinders people had on with respect to hearing this message because of the power of banks. So I don't want, it's really naive to think, well, we'll do the studies and we'll put the data together and then we'll get somewhere. But I have to say, in favor of all the lawsuits, some of them hit home and some of them had an impact. And some financial entities paid money. So I think we have to really get behind that fight, and the fight is now different. But it's a really tough one.
There's people thanking you. Kathy made a good point that putting a stop on one kind of abuse like predatory lending and subprime lending can actually create abuse in another area, like the rent-to-own contracts. And I think it speaks to me, and this is sort of my final comment, and I'm happy to give Aisha or Claudia a chance to give final comments too. My final comment is that's why creating a broad-based commitment to social justice is important, because if greed and these unfettered capitalistic kind of ventures continue to operate, then without a commitment to some higher values, then there will be continue to subvert and use public policy to benefit the few. Claudia?
I just want to thank everybody for getting involved in the conversation and their comments, and hope we can find ways to connect and to continue this work. Our center is eager to partner. We do have capacity around data, and I think data is one piece of sort of identifying the patterns, but then it really takes the legal action and the advocacy and the social justice movements to take that to really have impact. So we look forward to working together.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for taking the time to present such a compelling presentation. I'm very, very grateful. I encourage everybody, to the extent that we're serious about seeing funding for public schools in Ohio change, that we lobby our legislatures, and we work really, really hard with our local public school districts to make sure that the desire for change is heard. I think the Ed Choice moment presents a unique opportunity for us to do something, as you all have said, has not been able to be done since the 1970s or I guess that was the first time it was ruled unconstitutional, and then again in the 90s. So just grateful for this work, and encouraged that there's so many activists ready to move on the issue. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you all.
We have a networking session for those who want to just hang out and meet. My understanding is that Dr. Rhonda is going to be a part of that conversation. So if anybody wants to join for the noon hour, their links are available for that. Otherwise, we'll see you at 1 o'clock, where I think that's the presentation around Indigenous cultures.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Belinda, Kyle.